Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon, and I'm your host today. I'm also the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. Today's topic is an interesting one for me in the sense that it's the first time that what I've ever tried to do is do back-to-back episodes within the same week, in which the second episode is a direct follow-on of the first episode. I had a lot of engagement with the first episode, and so I wanted to see what would happen if I continued that engagement the second time around. Before I begin, what I'd like to do is welcome everyone here. If you are, no matter where you're watching, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, or no matter where you are in the world, please go into the comments or the live chat for today and let me know where you are connecting from. And I will get that out on the screen, give you a shout out if you give me a shout out. Thank you very much. And of course, if at any point during the course of the live stream, if you have a comment or a question, if you put it into the comments, I'll get it up on the screen and we can engage with your questions or the comments and see if we can come to some sort of resolution or incorporate your thinking into what it is the topic of today is going to be. And the topic of today is a very, very simple one. So this past Tuesday on the Chocolate Life Live, I said, I asked people on LinkedIn and Facebook, if you could make just one change in the world of cocoa and chocolate, what would that change be? Right? And I got some really, really good engagement on LinkedIn, and we'll review some of that engagement this morning. But then I decided, okay, if we have ideas for what the changes should be, the follow-up question is, what are some of the barriers to change, right, that are keeping things from happening? And very, very interestingly, I got almost no engagement on the response. I mean, one useful bit of engagement, which we'll get into. And for me, I'm kind of wondering if it's because I didn't post the same way, or I didn't give the same amount of time before today's live stream, so that people would have a chance to engage in that. But let's go really, really quickly. I'm going to share my screen. And as I do always, this is the homepage of the Chocolate Life Live. Right now, it is live. So if you go there, you can see that there is a link to today's live stream. I create a post for every single live stream. If you click on the post for the live stream, here we are. Most importantly, what you'll do is you'll see that here is the link to the YouTube. So if I were to click on this, you'd see me live and you'd get an echo, and that would be no fun. But in the future, if you want to come to this post, you can find the archive here on LinkedIn and YouTube, and as well as on Facebook. But I also, here is the question that we're looking to ask today, and then give some background, some ideas that I have about what it is that I'm looking to do. And then there's also a link to resources. And so if I mention a resource as a part of the live stream, what I will do is I will put a link to it. And one of the reasons why I do that is so that you don't have to be paying extremely close attention and try to grab the URLs. You can always come back to this page after the live stream and find things. And then, of course, hashtags if you want to promote this on your own social media channels. And so this is today's post. What's interesting about it for me is if I go take a look at the post for this past Tuesday, what you'll do is you'll see that there is a fair amount of engagement. I got a lot of engagement on this post. And then I also said, oh, here is something that I would propose, a change that I would make. And I did 2 of them. So what is perhaps a little interesting about that for me, as I'm trying to figure this out, and perhaps you can give me a comment on this if you're on LinkedIn and let me know, is that I created an entirely separate post for asking the question. So I created a post on LinkedIn. This one here, it's called Passion Lettuce here. It's linked to in today's post. And for me, it did fairly good. It got over 2,000 impressions, and it had 43 comments, including my own responses. So it's pretty good for me. And the question is, if you could make only one change to make things better in today's world of cocoa and chocolate, what would that one change be and why? And these include from Nick Saxby at Cocoa Runners. He'd say, and I think this is an important admission by Nick. He says, one change he'd like to see detached from any sensible route to get there is a radical change in awareness of the sustainable and ethical issues. So what he what Nick is proposing, I think, is that the average consumer needs to know more about what these issues are. And the question becomes, how do you go about engaging with the customer in a way that will give them an understanding and awareness that there are issues there that they need to pay attention to. It could be a label of some sort of like a recycling label or a fair trade label. There's something that we could put on the bar, but how is that going to work, and what is the uptake going to be like? How many brands are going to add something to their packaging that may or may not be useful to them. Terry Collingsworth responded to a post by Anna Lavin at Kit just about providing farmers with a living income. And Terry says, it might be interesting it would be easy to determine what a living wage might be and then to pay the farmers. And this living wage would be independent of what it is that they actually produced. So you're a farmer, you earn this much money. It doesn't matter if how much cocoa you produce. You get what we would call a universal basic income. And then what you would do is any profits that you made from selling your cocoa would be on top of the universal basic income. I believe that's what it is that's being proposed. Sean Eskenazi made a very, very simple point. The more money to farmers is the one change that he would like to see. And that sparked a really, really interesting conversation between Sean and others and Howard Yana Shapiro. Howard was a Mars Fellow. He's a very highly respected person in the world of cocoa and chocolate. And he brings up a whole lot of very, very interesting points. And so I encourage everyone to go and read that, the back and forth on LinkedIn. If you're not on LinkedIn, I still believe that this page is public and I've linked to it. If not, connect with me on LinkedIn and you'll be able to read this post. And anybody who does connect with me, just mention in a message in the connection that you're here because of this post, and I will make sure to connect back with you so that we can grow our network. So Anthony Fountain is the head of something called the Voice Network. They produce the Cocoa Barometer, and I've known Anthony for a number of years, and there's a really, really good back and forth with Anthony and Sean and Howard around these issues, including some interesting graphs which show a negative correlation between increased productivity and farmer income. So what happens, this is counterintuitive, but it is in fact something that needs to be considered, is that when you increase the amount of cocoa in a given area, the price goes down. And at some point, producing more actually will return you to levels of income which are lower than they were when you were producing less. And these graphs, which are from the Cocoa Barometer, as a matter of fact, show that particular relationship. And it's very interesting, and it's something that most people don't consider. Now, for people who are interested in a deeper dive, Anthony did provide the link to the most recent Cocoa Barometer. It's in the post. You can go, and here is the 2022 Cocoa Barometer. I can recommend you go and download it and have a read through it just to get an idea of some nuances. But keep in mind that this is written from the point of view of a particular organization's viewpoints. And so it gets added to a whole bunch of other statistics, a whole bunch of other information. And I think the research is good, but it does need to be taken with a grain of salt and compared with other bits of research. Statistics, as we know, can be used to buttress any opinion. And so you need to be very, very careful. But they do say that the calculations were done by an independent third party at a place called the Southwinds Institute. And you can go and you can go see the background research that should be done. And I have to credit Anthony for being this thorough in his response. So here's the information that we published, and here's our primary source for the information. Really, really good thing to understand is when there is an attribution of something in a press release. For example, look to see what the primary sources are that are cited. You want to go back to the original source. So if a press release cites a source and that source is a secondary source, you want to go find the secondary source's primary source to understand if what it is being reported is not being altered in some way, either deliberately or accidentally. Right? Misrepresented. It could be on purpose or it could be accidentally. So really, really good. Kudos, hats off to Anthony for doing that. So Howard Yana Shapiro says, okay, enough is enough. right? And this was done after Tuesday's live stream. Let's talk to me. Why don't I organize a meeting in the Ivory Coast or Ghana, like a big conference in 2008, 15 years ago? Um, how do we get all the activists in the space together to go and do something, right? It's not a bad idea. I pushed back on Howard saying, how do we fund it? Number one, I'm not in a position to fund an international conference in an African nation, either physically or virtually. And one of the questions that I have, which speaks specifically to today's topic, which is how do we make sure that the people who are there are actually not part of the challenges that the industry faces? And how do we make sure that their voices, while they're listened to, don't disproportionately influence the recommendations that are being made? And then, of course, we have the question of, how do if the group does come out and does make recommendations, how are these recommendations implemented and enforced? So, yeah, another conference like the World Cocoa Foundation has a conference, Fair Trade has a conference, ICCO has, everybody has conferences, and these issues related to living wages coming up everywhere. Right. So why do I think that this small independent conference will have any impact where very well-funded organizations who have much better access to political power players, both in producing countries and in the European Union and in the United States, why we'd be in a position to be able to do something meaningful? I don't know the answer to the question, and maybe that's a barrier to change. Maybe I'm just too cynical. Maybe I don't see the path forward in doing this, and that's actually might be a very good barrier to change. And I'm sort of interested in your thoughts. Is my reluctance to move forward on this because there's some barrier in my mind that you think is getting in the way, or do you think that there's something else that might be there? But go take a look at this exchange. I think is a fascinating exchange that's going on there. I would push to triple the income. Right. So Anthony talks about doubling the income. Howard says let's triple the income. And my first response to that is, so what does tripling the income do to the price of cocoa? And what would increasing the price of cocoa do to the companies whose businesses rely on cocoa being inexpensive? So would consumers be willing to pay significantly more? And I'm not talking about people in the specialty chocolate world, right? Consumers are already paying $10, $12, $13 a bar, right, on average, or 9 or 10 or more, are probably more understanding about the willingness or the need to be willing to pay more for the cocoa as long as that price increase is getting back down to the farmer, right? But when we're talking about mass market candy, the things that you find in a grocery store, most of what Mars produces, most of what Mondelez produces, and other companies like that, would tripling the income, which would have a huge increase in the price of cocoa, how would the market react to that? And I think that's one of the huge barriers that do exist. So, go and figure, is tripling income, you think, viable? Is even doubling income a viable output? And Howard and Anthony does respond to Howard and talk about some of the challenges associated with this. And you can see I push back. Who provides the funding? How do we keep the proceedings from being hijacked? So I would recommend that you go and take a look at this. And one by one, as you read this and you listen to the ideas that are presented, where do you think the barriers to change exist that would keep all of these things from happening? Right? I'm really, really curious to know what you think. So you can go and respond on LinkedIn, right? If you are a member, you can go and respond on LinkedIn. I'd be really interested to know. If you are not a member of LinkedIn, what you can do is you can go to the Chocolate Life. If you're not a member, you can sign up for free. You have to be a member to add comments to any post on the Chocolate Life. And you can go to the post here, which is the one on barriers to change. You can scroll down to the bottom and you can add your comments to this post. So right? This post is in fact sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. So become a member and sponsor the work that I do. There are free as well as premium memberships. And one of the benefits of being a member is the ability to engage in the conversation on thechocolateLife.com. So we appreciate your doing that. So I think that one of the disappointments for me today was that, in fact, there was really only one response to my question, what are the barriers to change? And that barrier came from Sean Eskenazi. And Sean said the number one barrier to change in his mind, or the biggest barrier to change in his mind, was the need to maintain shareholder value, which I think is a good response. I think I would present it in a little more nuanced way than the need to maintain shareholder value. Please note that there was another response to this post, but it had nothing to do with the question being asked, so I did respond to it, and that's why you're seeing it there. But we can go back and forth between the posts. We can see that, man, there's a lot of responses to this post, and almost nothing to this post. And I'm kind of again, I'm trying to understand why that is the case. And number one is, do you like this format? Do you like the idea of presenting a question on a Tuesday and then going and responding to the question on a Friday? Let me know in the comments what you think, and check in. Just let me know where you're connecting from, what part of the world you're connecting from. I'll get your comments, I'll get your shout out on the screen, and we can to respond to it and acknowledge you here in real time during the live stream. But I want to go back and look at my post, right? And I want to respond to what it is that Sean said, and see if what I might be able to do is provide a broader context, right? And the main barrier I see, right, is that we live in a system that prioritizes what I think of as extractive economics. And the parallel that I draw to extractive economics is the parallel between extractive agriculture and regenerative agriculture. In a system of extractive agriculture, the people who are benefiting from the land, the use of the land, so they are growing crops and harvesting them, the companies that maintain the land, right, don't care about its long-term viability. So what they're doing is they're engaging in agricultural practices whose primary concern is extracting as much value from the land as they possibly can. And when the land can no longer produce properly, they move on to some other place. Now, they will do what they can to extend the useful life of that land by using a lot of chemical inputs, both on the fertilizer side, the pesticide, insecticide side. They will invest in that, but they're not going to invest in land management practices, holistic land management practices that are going to make sure that the land is capable of supporting the level of agriculture over the course of generations. And that's what we talk about when we're thinking about the concept of regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture is all about a system which ensures that the land is going to remain productive for future generations. And this incorporates aspects of both the environmental sustainability component that we talked about last week, as well as the environmental sustainability component. I'm sorry, the environmental and economic sustainability components. So when we talk about environmental sustainability, what we're saying is that the land is managed in a way that is healthy, productive, and thriving 100 years from now. And when we talk about economic sustainability, it means there's enough money in the system enabled to support the environmental sustainability goals, as well as the social sustainability goals. And social sustainability has to do with the fact that farmers live in communities. And not only do the farmers need to be healthy and thriving, not only does the land need to be healthy and thriving, but the communities need to be healthy and thriving as well. And so in an extractive economic environment, the primary concern that everybody has is to extract as much value as possible in the shortest period of time, and then to take that value and move it from where production is being done and deliver it to, in this case, investors, which is what Sean says, right? Sean says maintaining investor value. So we're taking money from people who can't afford to give it up, and in many cases, we're giving it to people who don't need it. But the idea of extractive economics is we don't care, right, about maintaining the land, maintaining the local environment that supports the land and is supported by the land. We don't care about the communities that the farmers live in. We're just taking all the value because what we need to do is we need to make sure that the share price stays high. And what that means is that we need to be competitive with my company needs to be competitive with all the other companies that are out there. So, for example, if Mars or Mondelez were to say, listen, we're just going to unilaterally start paying 3 times the amount that we're currently paying for cocoa, and we're going to make sure that that cocoa goes directly to the farmer, and unilaterally, I suppose that they could do it, there are a couple of reasons why they won't and that they can't, right? Even though in theory, yeah, let's just go pay enough to increase farmer income. The first reason why is that, again, they live in a competitive landscape. If Mondelez tripled the price of cocoa and it increased the price of their products to consumers so that at the shelf, what was $1 one week became $2 the next week, consumers would stop buying their products. And so Mondelez is not going to do this. No company is going to do this if what it does is it unilaterally increases the price of their product to the point where they're no longer competitive in the marketplace. So that's a huge barrier to change, is this economic one. What we've seen is that most consumers are used to paying very little money for chocolate, right? In Reddit forums and other kinds of places, we see, even a Tony's chocolate only bar at 180 grams for £4 is considered to be hugely expensive. And people are going, well, I'd rather have a Galaxy bar for £1.25. Even if they do the math, the Galaxy bar, weight for weight, ends up costing a lot more than the Tony's bar. There's this whole conversation around price at the consumer level is not rational, right? But it's buttressed by this idea that chocolate is cheap. Chocolate always has been cheap. Chocolate always needs to be cheap. Somehow it is a birthright. It is something we are privileged for, right? It is not something for which we need to care about, right? The conditions and the lives and the livelihoods of the people who are growing the cocoa. And that's actually, I've seen that response, right? When I've said, well, if you buy a bar and it costs this much, chances are it's that cheap because illegal child labor is involved in the production of the cocoa, or there is actual slavery involved in the production of the cocoa. And there's a direct response. It's like, why should I care? Right? Which is not very compassionate, not very empathetic kind of response. But I think it is rather emblematic of where many consumers are when it comes to a lot of the kinds of foods that they consume. It's cheap. It always has been cheap, and therefore it should always be cheap. So we have that. So we've got that aspect of the marketplace is companies cannot do it unilaterally. And so therefore, because it would raise the price of their products to the point where they would no longer be competitive in the marketplace. And I see that as one huge barrier to change, right? Is that, right? Now, if I'm a publicly traded company, and this would be Mondelez, Lindt, for example, as opposed to Mars, Barry Callebaut is a publicly traded company as well. The other reason they're not going to do it is because if they engaged in this practice, in any practice that made the company less profitable, so it made the company again, lowered the dividends that were being paid, changed the rate of return on money, all these kinds of very, very complex financial issues, which investors use to value the companies that they choose to invest in or not to invest in. Right? There would be a shareholder revolt. And excuse me, the CEO of the company would be ousted. Members of the board of directors would be voted out by activist investors who would then replace the CEO and the members of the board of directors with people who said, yes, our job is to make sure that the most important thing is returning money to investors and making sure that the value of the company grows rather than is diminished. Right? And so we have these two really, really interesting competing forces, right? One of which Sean mentioned, investor value, right? And the other one is just competitiveness in the marketplace. And the two of them are inextricably related. So Mars is a private company. Mars on its own could decide we are going to pay a lot more for the cocoa that we purchase because we don't have to answer to shareholders. We just have members of the family who are the owners, and that's it. And we would be happy to only earn $1 billion this year rather than $3 billion this year if they could. However, what would happen is that when their products, I suppose what they could do is they could eat the difference, right? They could just sell all the products at a loss. Not a business model that anybody would recommend. But if their products went on the shelves and they were significantly more expensive than all of their competitors' products, then what would happen is that they'd see their sales drop precipitously, right? And they would no longer be viable as a business, right? And that's a huge barrier to change. There is a really, really interesting framework for looking at projects, which is called STP. It's nothing to do with the oil company, but it's called Situation, True Targets, and Proposals. And part of the situation analysis that gets done, the idea is you have 6 or 7 points that describe the situation. You have the true targets, which are the 1 or 2 things that we're actually trying to affect change in as a part of this. And then a series of proposals for how you are in response to the situation in order to be able to respond to the true targets. Right? So we have all that going on. One of the things that is a part of the situation and proposal analysis is one of the first things you want to do is you want to find out whose economic and political positions are being threatened by what it is that you're doing. Right? So we have political power, we have economic power, we're suggesting a change. And so, for example, somebody who is in a position of privilege might no longer be in that position of privilege. It affects the power in the organization or the country where they are, and or it affects their income. And what you've just done is you've created a barrier. You've created somebody who's actively going to work against trying to implement the changes that you are trying to put into place. Right? So you always want to make sure, as a part of whatever it is that you're doing in terms of looking at the changes that you want to make, so what the barriers to change are, and one of the first places to go is whose economic privilege and whose political privilege are being threatened. And so in this particular case, if we were to say, okay, we want to do X and Y and Z, we need to understand that the economic structure and the cocoa culture of countries which are next door to each other, the Ivory Coast and Ghana, or Peru and Ecuador, and then Bolivia and Peru, and then Ecuador and Colombia, and then Colombia and Venezuela. I mean, the barriers to change are different in each one of those countries. And so one of the challenges of a one-size-fits-all model, let's raise the price by 10 cents, for example, per kilo. So we're going to add a $200 premium as a living income differential in cocoa coming out of this country. What you find is that the farmers and the government may decide, yeah, I don't want to put myself at an economic disadvantage by making my cocoa more expensive, just off the top, than somebody else's cocoa. So you need to understand, in the producing country, number one, what the barriers to change are. And they're going to be cultural, they are going to be political. And if you don't get the buy-in at both of those levels, you are not going to be able to affect the change meaningfully. And this is all recognized by what I think is perhaps the most important pillar when we talk about sustainability. It's mentioned on occasion. So for example, Good Sam has taken the People, Profit, Planet, triple P, triple bottom line, and they talk about the people, the planet, and then prosperity for all. And I think that's a really, really good way to recast the triple bottom line. But there's another component of that, which is we need what I think of as, in addition to environmental sustainability policies, economic sustainability policies, and then social sustainability policies, we need sustainable markets. So we need markets, most of which are outside the producing country, of people and organizations who are willing to pay what it takes to implement the environmental, economic, and social sustainability policies within the producing country. So without the sustainable markets, none of this stuff happens. And where the primary disconnect and disassociation is that extractive economic policies, and we might actually go back to Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics in the 1950s, and the notion that, the purpose of a publicly traded, the purpose of any C company, a C corporation, is to return money to investors. That is the purpose. It is the primary purpose. Profitability and then redistribution of wealth, right, is the primary purpose of a C corporation. We sort of funnel those ideas through Reaganomics ideas of trickle down, right? And then we have the situation we have right now when it comes to extractive economics, which is one of the things that every company is going to do, every big company is going to do, is they're going to try to externalize as many risks as possible and as many expenses as possible onto someone else. So, for example, we look at members of Big Chocolate who have for more than 20 years been fighting liability for illegal labor. They have acknowledged that such illegal labor exists in their cocoa supply chain, but they're fighting every attempt legally and legislatively to be able to come up with a comprehensive solution which will end the problem, right? And one of the reasons why they're doing it is because it is in their economic and political best interest to resist those changes. What they want to do is they want to say, listen, we contract through third parties. And so it's not our responsibility to do this. We may not have an excuse to say we don't know that it's there. We do know that it's there. We've acknowledged, we're signatories to the Harkin-Engel Protocol. We've acknowledged that the problem exists, but everything is at arm's length, right? And the companies can't get together and do something directly. So there exists enough resources within what we colloquially call Big Chocolate, the largest 10 companies in cocoa and chocolate in the world. There exist enough resources that if they wanted to solve the problem, they could solve the problem. They could get together among them and solve the problem. However, now what you do is you have an antitrust case for collusion in fixing markets, right? If they all said, listen, we're all going to triple the price of cocoa, or we're going to triple farmer income, and it's going to raise the price of cocoa, 120% or 150%, all of the shareholders would get together, and probably some governments would get together and say, you can't do that because you're now illegally colluding to fix prices in the marketplace. And that's not where we are. We're not going to allow you to do that. And so again, that's an example of a barrier to change. It's an institutional barrier to change, which is going to be one of the main impediments to the kinds of changes that were being suggested in last Tuesday's live stream. What are the changes we'd like to see? For the most part, they had to do with making sure that farmers earned a reasonable amount of money for the hard work that they do in farming cocoa. Now, I think that there's a really interesting post, and I linked to this in this post, is that Terry Collingsworth, people who followed the Chocolate Life Live know that Terry is a lawyer at the International Rights Advocate. He's the executive director, I believe, one of the co-founders, and he's been working on holding Big Chocolate in the United States, or members of Big Chocolate in the United States, accountable for their continued reliance on illegal labor in their supply chains in West Africa, both from a trafficking perspective as well as children who are being asked to do things that are illegal under international labor law. And Terry posted this morning, not in response to what I was talking about in my LinkedIn post, but he says that Industrial agriculture is the primary driver of the destruction of forests and other critical natural ecosystems. And what he says is that Cargill, which is the largest food company in the world, and it is privately held. So it is a family-owned company in the United States. And if you were to go look at the brands that Cargill owns, you would just be astonished. I mean, it is almost impossible, I discovered, to lead a Cargill-free life. You go into the grocery store, and even if it doesn't say Cargill on a lot of products, Cargill is behind it, and you have to look very, very closely to understand. And as a private company, they don't necessarily need to disclose all these things. Um, um, so it becomes very, very challenging to understand just how pervasive the influence of one company can be. I mean, another aspect that's directly in the world of cocoa and chocolate and confectionery is there are reports that um, as many as 25% of all the confectionery products in the world, and so this is not only chocolate and chocolate candy, but also ice cream and baked goods, sweet baked goods, but confectionery products and baked products have a Barry Callebaut branded ingredient in them. And when you think about that, one company is involved in 25% of all of these things. The reach and influence is just insane. But what Terry is pointing out here is that as an impediment to change, right, as the world's largest agribusiness, Cargill presents both the greatest opportunity and the greatest obstacle to eradicating the destruction of nature. And I'm going to include destruction of nature. I'm going to include oppressing the lives and livelihoods of farmers into that as well, because farmers who are maybe desperate, and I'm not saying that all farmers are desperate, but farmers who are desperate are going to do things to make sure that their families are taken care of, that many of us would consider to be detrimental to the environment and maybe illegal under some legal frameworks. And so the power is there, right? Right, and the obstacle is there. At the same time, we can be the biggest barriers to change. At the same time, we can be the greatest champions and implementers of change. And I'm going to leave this up here. I've actually linked to this post. And what I'm going to do is, you may not actually, if you're not a LinkedIn member, you may not be able to get to this post, but there is a link here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go follow that link and embed the link on today's post on the Chocolate Life, so you can go look at the Stand Earth directly. You can look at what that report is going to be. So Stand Earth, new report, outlines how Cargill's broken promises threaten the family's legacies. And this is actually might be a way to, break the Gordian knot, although I don't know necessarily the case. If in fact what can be done is that the future of the Mars family name, if the future of the Cargill family name, if the future of the Jacobs, right, family name, and Jacobs is very, very closely associated with Barry Callebaut in many ways. It's really, really important. If the legacy of these families can be threatened, and I'm not saying, again, it's the public perception of the legacy. I'm not actually talking about physical right now. I want you to know that I'm not advocating that at all when I come to threaten. But if the legacy is challenged, let's put it that way, and it can be cast in a negative way, that what may happen is that may be something that says, okay, I don't want to be remembered as a company that contributed to the downfall of cocoa industry in Western Africa, because I wasn't willing to live up to my obligations under, for example, the Harkin-Engel Protocol. My company that was a signatory wasn't able to live up to the Harkin-Engel Protocol. And so I want to go and really, really focus on this notion, okay, of extractive economics, right? And understand that we have this notion of extractive agriculture and regenerative agriculture, and we understand what that means. So we understand that regenerative agriculture is a system in which the the resources of the land are managed in a way that they are healthy and productive for multiple generations. And it is a holistic system. It's going to look at water. Um, it's going to look at whatever kinds of agricultural chemicals are being added. It's going to be look at how much labor is required. It's going to look at what the effect of certain agricultural practices might be in terms of erosion, all sorts of issues. We're looking at regenerative agriculture is a holistic system. And one of the things that we're trying to do in a regenerative agriculture system is we're trying to make sure that the organic matter in the soil, right, is kept above a certain minimal level. We want to make sure that the soil remains healthy, that the microbiome in the soil, all the organisms in the soil are there, so it can support not only the crop um, that is being grown, but also the insects and animals and birds which are required to support anything. Everything needs to be done um, from this holistic perspective. It's really important to understand that's the difference between an extractive agricultural system is all about we don't care about the land, we don't care about the animals, we don't care about water, we don't care about the health of the soil. We're just trying to extract maximum value out of that soil for as long as we possibly can. And when it stops being productive, we move somewhere else and we continue that. And most importantly, all of those costs, right? So when I think, for example, of the oil industries drilling in the Amazon and the environmental devastation of oil spills and in building roads which cross migration paths, for example, and make it very, very difficult for animals to continue the existence that they've enjoyed for thousands, if not millions of years. Um, all of the costs associated, for example, with fixing the land after it has been devastated by an oil spill is externalized. The company is not responsible for that. They've moved the risk off of their balance sheet. They moved economic responsibility off of their balance sheet, so they no longer need to recognize it, and it doesn't become a part of their bottom line. So extractive economics is built on these twin notions of externalizing everything that we possibly can, pushing the costs off to other people, pushing the cost off to future generations. I mean, we've seen, many large companies were aware of effects of potential for global warming doing to enhance greenhouse gas emission. They were aware of that in the 60s, if not beforehand, and they said, well, it's not our problem. We're just going to push it off into future generations. We're not going to do anything to change it because it affects profits. And therefore, we can't do anything. And so we're going to do everything we can to try to obfuscate the problem and then to lobby that it's not for real. It's not really a risk that any of us needs to worry about. So we have this regenerative and extractive agriculture component, which is reflective in a perfect analogy, I believe, between extractive economics and regenerative economics. And I think that one of the ways to think about an answer to the problem, right, to overcome, to jump over the barriers of change, is to imagine and then to create a framework where we move from extractive economics to regenerative economics, that we reframe what it means to be a valuable company, right? And if we can reframe what it means to be a valuable company, then we can provide the legal cover, which would enable the executives and the board of directors of these companies to say, okay, as a part of what we're doing, we need to be able to consider factors X and Y and Z that either temporarily or in the long term are going to affect profitability and the return to shareholders. But legally, we are allowed to do these kinds of things. So we see some frameworks to do this. So B Corp status could be one way to do that, because what it enables companies to do in their charter is to say, listen, we as a company are going to consider factors like making sure that we're investing in the land and investing in the farmers, because long-term productivity is important to the financial stability of the company. We're not just trying to rape and pillage the land and the people for maximum short-term benefits. So B Corp could be one way to be able to move towards a regenerative economic kind of status or a framework. But this notion of um, the purpose of a company is to maximize shareholder return in the short term is one of the biggest barriers to change. And because of the concentration of power, so 90% of the world's cocoa and chocolate is handled by fewer than 20 companies. And even if these companies do not actively collude, it turns out that the market forces, right, are keeping them from being able to even consider the kind of systemic changes that are necessary. And so what is happening is we now find legislative frameworks. So in the European Union, in their ESG, the environmental sustainability and governance frameworks about risk reporting and being able to acknowledge risks and move the risks into the bottom line is a part of that change. However, there's a difference between the EU regulations and the American regulations. And there's one thing we know about big companies: they're going to exploit the loopholes that exist between the gaps in how the legislation is written in different countries. And what this may mean is that some companies are going to move their political nexus where they're headquartered to jurisdictions where they are held to account differently. They just may decide to abandon a market because the restrictions are too onerous. I mean, it sounds crazy, but this is the sort of thing that has been done. And so we need to be very, very careful about that. And yet the EU legislation with respect to ESG, the recent traceability guidelines, which say that you need to certify and independently verify that that whatever product you're importing did not contribute to illegal labor, doesn't have an illegal labor component to it, did not contribute to deforestation, right, is a legislative move in that direction. Right? But what we have two different sets of legislation. And again, the rules may or may not be in perfect alignment. And there will be people who are immediately trying to game the system and try to figure out how to go and take advantage of very, very small differences in the legislation, the loopholes that are created in that way. Right? And these are attempts to address some of the biggest barriers to change. Now, I think that one of the things that needs to be done, right, is to address one of the biggest social barriers to change when it comes to consumers. And one of the biggest social barriers to change is greenwashing. And companies that say they are doing X and Y and Z, but in fact, they are doing something which is very different. Now, I personally believe that if you were to look at the annual report for Tony's Chocolate Lonely, what you do is you'd see that what they're reporting, right, in the report and the way they're reporting it, if you do a deep dive under the surface and you look very closely at it, that what the company is doing is they are not accurate, in my opinion, right? They are not accurately representing the impact, the actual impact that they're having in the marketplace. And so that would be an example of greenwashing in my estimation. And I encourage everyone. I will put a link to the Tony's annual report in the most recent annual report in today's post for the live stream. And so you can go and take a look at it. And I would be really interested in people going through that report and providing me their response. What do they think about the annual report? Do they think that I'm way off base when I make that representation? For example, go take a look and find out how many farming families Tony's actually claims that they are benefiting, understanding that they've been selling chocolate bars for 20 years, and go, wow, I mean, what does this really mean? How much of an impact is Tony have? Now, it's an outsized impact. As a company, they're a single issue company around the notion of illegal child labor. Right. But what happens when they actually solve the problem of illegal child labor? I don't know that they have a backup plan. It's a single, their entire business depends on the existence of illegal labor. What happens when there is no illegal labor? What do they do? Right. So I sort of wonder about that. And that's a problem that many NGOs, Tony's is not an NGO, but that's a problem that many NGOs face. Fair trade faces a problem that if they actually solve the problem, the need for them goes away. right? And so to some extent, they are dependent upon the continued existence of the problem. There is an entire sustainability industry that depends upon, right, these problems never being addressed, because if people address them, they put themselves out of a job. I'm not saying that these are people are active barriers to change, but there is some psychological barrier which is there, as people understand. Yeah, they, that I don't know how many recognize this fundamental bit of cognitive dissonance. If we solve the problem, I put myself out of a job. I would love to have everybody who's the head of an NGO saying, our goal is to put ourselves out of a job in 5 years, right? And man, if that would be a great thing. If all of the board of directors of FLO, of Fair Trade, and all of the fair trade related organizations said, our goal is to put ourselves out of job in 5 years, I would be hugely impressed if the people at the Cocoa and Forest Initiatives, at the International Cocoa Initiative, and all these organizations say our job is to put ourselves out of business. I would be really impressed, and maybe that's. Let me know. What do you think? I mean, would that help break the Gordian knot so that we could finally break through? Right. In the last couple of minutes before we go, I realize this has been somewhat of a rant, but I want to do a little quick reset. You're listening to the Chocolate Life Live, or you're watching the Chocolate Life Live. My name's Clay Gordon. I'm talking today about a two-part exercise, and it's a format I think I want to be able to um, replicate in the future, where on the first episode of a week, which is Tuesday, I bring up a challenge, right? And this week, the idea was, if you could suggest just one change to cocoa and chocolate, what would that one change be? And I got a lot of really, really good responses over on LinkedIn. I'm really, really happy with the level of response I got. The conversation is continuing. But the second post, the second episode this week, did not get the same response. And I'm going to tinker with the format. Number one, do you like the format? Let me know in the comments whether you like the format. But I'm going to tinker with the format to see if I can get a more engagement on the second half. So I present a problem, and then we're going to try to see if we can work on a solution. So I'd like to play with that, but I'd also like to remind people that every episode of the Chocolate Life Live is sponsored by the membership of the Chocolate Life Live. If you're not a member, you can go to a link. I'm logged in at the moment, so where it says account, you will see a join link, or at the bottom right hand corner, it will say join. Just click there, join the Chocolate Life. And what that means is, among other things, is that there is the ability to comment on every single one of these posts. And so you get that to become a part of the conversation. Also, if you're watching on LinkedIn or YouTube or Facebook, you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on Facebook. And if you're YouTube, go to the Chocolate Wire, the Chocolate Life channel on YouTube, like the video you're watching, and subscribe to the channel. All that does is help expand. Not all that does. It is the important job of expanding the reach of what it is that we're doing. I would also like to make one other announcement, which is that next week is Confectionery Live. I am the technical editor of International Confectionery Magazine. I'm going to be giving a panel on two approaches to addressing some of the issues we talked about today. So how do we make it possible to increase the lives and livelihoods, or improve the lives and livelihoods of farmers through projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as in Colombia. And I'm also doing a panel on a presentation on sustainable packaging. There is a link to Confectionery Live on today's post. You can go click on that and join the conversation. It's next week, next Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. So I may not do a Chocolate Life Live on Tuesday, because I will be participating in the live aspects of Confectionery Live next week. And I hope you can click on the link, and I can hope that you will join me there. And that's it for today. I want to thank everybody who has watched all the way through to the very end, for joining me here on the Chocolate Life Live. And I hope that what you will do is be motivated to go and think about these questions. think about the questions, and the way you think, the way you react to them emotionally, rather than the way you think about them intellectually. There's a wonderful exercise that I use when I'm not certain about what I think about something, about a very important decision, is that I will flip a coin and I will call heads or tails. And then what I do is I think about how we react to whether it came up heads or tails. So it's more about my feelings about how about the outcome, which is decided randomly, rather than thinking, okay, now I need to go and do this. So for me, it's very, very helpful. And so I think that thinking about the way you feel about these things as opposed to the way you think about these things, as a driver of going forward, could be really, really useful. And I'm useful to you, useful to me, if you share your thoughts in the comments, either on YouTube, LinkedIn, on Facebook, or on thechocolatelife.com. And then finally, I think that there's a third thing that we can look through. So we talked about extractive agriculture and regenerative agriculture. I think there's a parallel between that and extractive economics and regenerative economics. And I think we need to move, as a society towards that goal in order to be able to achieve a lot of the objectives that we've talked about. But there's a third aspect of this that I think needs to be considered, is that right now I think that one of the barriers to change, in both agriculture and economics, is in the political sphere. And I would extend the parallel that I've been talking about and move it away from, and not move it away from, but expand the parallel to include the political sphere. And so right now we live, right, globally, for the most part, within a system of extractive politics, right? And I invite you to think about, okay, if we think about the parallel between extractive agriculture and extractive economics, what does an extractive political system look like? And then if we think about regenerative agriculture and regenerative economics, what would a regenerative political system look like? Right? And it's not necessarily a conservative thing. It's not necessarily a liberal thing. It's not libertarian. I'm not looking at it from any of those points of view. I think it is an apolitical exercise to go and imagine what this might be. But I'm really, really interested in knowing your thoughts about how the current political system we live within is a barrier to change within the economic and agricultural systems which exist. Right? It's something that I think about on a regular basis, and I hope that what I've done is inspire you to think about that as well. I think that any day where we have an opportunity to learn something is a good day. And I'll end by reminding everybody, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. So until the next time, ciao, everyone.